This is the next in the Patriot Minute series. I'm Grandpa Rick. I'm going to talk about a young man who came here as an immigrant and changed the course of our nation's history. His name was Thaddeus. Thomas Jefferson knew the young man, and this is what he said, quote, "He is as pure a son of liberty as I have ever known. A liberty for all, not the few or the rich alone," unquote. Today's hero, we're going to talk about, like many in America, is an immigrant from far-off lands. And in the case of great American immigrant contributors like Thaddeus Kościuszko, when arriving in our nation, he gave far more than he took. Thaddeus was born in eastern Poland near the Lithuanian border on February 12, 1746. His parents owned a small amount of land, and while they were actually from the minor nobility of the country, his parents were relatively poor, and they were forced to struggle all their lives to survive. Still, they were respected and hardworking people, very religious people. Thaddeus Kościuszko's father had a number of serfs who worked his land. From an early age, Thaddeus's father impressed upon his son the importance of treating the workers, the men and women working their estate, with fairness and respect. Thaddeus grew to manhood a lover of human dignity, and especially the liberty of mind and body. He believed that men and women, no matter where they came from, had a soul sent from God. Thaddeus's father died, as I mentioned, when he was still a boy, but he was able to attend a prestigious Catholic high school, though his father or his family struggled to pay his way. At 19, he was accepted into the Royal Military Academy based on his merit in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. His likability there and his dependability and his hard work ethic did him well. He was soon at the top of his class. This caught the eye of the Polish monarch, King Stanislaw, who enjoyed discussing military tactics with the young student and offered him a state scholarship to travel to Paris to expand his education. In Paris, he studied art, engineering, and military strategy, particularly engineering. He focused on that, as well as Enlightenment philosophy. He loved this, focusing primarily on the freedom of man. He pored over the works of Locke, John Locke, and Rousseau. Graduating, he returned to Poland in 1774. He was grown now, and he was seeking a wife and a job. For a time, he was hired to tutor a young noblewoman named Ludwika Sosnowski. Soon they fell in love and planned to get married. But the young woman's father vehemently opposed their marriage, driving young Thaddeus away. The unjust, discriminatory actions by Ludwika's father had powerful impact on Thaddeus. He had always judged people by their character, not their family name or wealth. With no hope of marrying Ludwika, he made a hard decision, something he did not want. But he decided to leave Poland and seek his fortune abroad, to explore the world and make something of himself. Traveling to Germany and then to Paris, he met supporters of the budding American Revolution. And so he grabbed a fast ship bound for the American colonies. There he met Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia and was introduced to George Washington into the Continental Army. His intellect and military training that he had impressed key American founders. He was anxious to serve the cause, so was given the rank of colonel and assigned to design and build forts along the Delaware River to protect the American positions. By December, he was heavily involved in the design and construction of Fort Mercer, a strategic fort placed above the Delaware River on the New Jersey shore. Recall General Mercer, Hugh Mercer, was the doctor of the troops. He was killed at the Battle of Princeton, and so this fort was named after him. In the summer of 1777, Thaddeus was given the seemingly impossible task of using his engineering skills to delay British troops, who were then led in the north by General John Burgoyne, who planned to rush down the Hudson River and join with the British forces coming up from New York and put the Americans in a pincer movement. Prior to Thaddeus's arrival, British troops were making 50 or 60 miles a day in their trek to come south. And when the young Polish engineer arrived, however, he soon had the American troops blockading the trails, waterways with obstructions, flooding the pathways by damming nearby streams, putting up obstacles everywhere. The British Army's progress suddenly ground practically to a halt. It took British troops 22 days to travel just 20 miles. So effective was Thaddeus and his engineers. Then we come to a key turning point. Young Thaddeus proved that the most potent weapon in war is not the musket or the cannon. No, it's the shovel. His talent in building breastworks and trenches, laying down obstacles if were needed, his skilled placement of limited numbers of American cannon were major contributors to the colonial army's victory at the key Battle of Saratoga. Yes, the American win at Saratoga was a key turning point in the war for independence. The reasons demonstrate that there was a global chess match going on at the time involving the French and others. Up to the Battle of Saratoga, the French king Louis XVI believed that the Americans could not possibly win the war against the powerful British. But with this victory and the surrender of an entire British army under the command of General John Burgoyne, that changed every equation for the French king. He determined to go ahead and recognize the young American Republic, and then he formed a commercial alliance and finally a military alliance, which turned the tide of the war. Without the American victory at Saratoga, which would not have been possible without the engineering work and design skills of Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, France may not have decided to join with the American Continental Army in our cause, and history could be very different for us today. Further south from this battle, Saratoga, Thaddeus was given the critical task of fortifying the heights above the Hudson River that would become the famous American fort of West Point. It was there in that building project, that Thaddeus met the clever, witty, and always charming Agrippa Hull, a free black man from New England, who would become Thaddeus's close friend, his assistant, and comrade at arms. Agrippa appeared to better strengthen, in fact, and deepen Thaddeus's native hatred of slavery. Completing the fortifying of West Point, Thaddeus traveled with Agrippa south to meet with his friend and mentor, General Horatio Gates. Gates did not last long, however, in command because of his, lack of skill and probably his arrogance. He was soon replaced by the capable, hard-charging General Nathanael Greene. Thaddeus would fight alongside General Greene for the remainder of the war, a key player in multiple American victories. Then the war shifted further south to the Carolinas, to Virginia. And when the war shifted to this area in the country, Thaddeus had a particular knack at reading and memorizing this very different topography and how to best exploit it. As British General Cornwallis with his larger army moved swiftly to corner Greene and the Continental Army in the south, Thaddeus helped save the Americans on multiple occasions by confusing the British with some really clever tactics and keeping them always off balance and unable to engage with the Americans on ground of their choosing. The fighting in the Carolinas was different than it had been in the North. The British found that the Americans, they were always a step ahead of them, which frustrated Cornwallis to no end. Thaddeus helped outflank Cornwallis in improving the Americans' mobility, and he did this skillfully. He rapidly built and designed a small fleet of very light, flat-bottomed boats that the Americans could tote between the many swamps and rivers that were in the south, particularly in the Tidewater area, quickly and silently crossing waterways just as the British were about to corner them. In June of 1781, while he was trying to get too close to a British encampment to figure out what was going on, he and his small group of scouts were attacked by British soldiers, and he was bayoneted and wounded in the buttocks. They fought off their attackers, but was embarrassed. They escaped, but he was embarrassed for being discovered at all. But I think mostly he was embarrassed for being wounded in an embarrassing spot of his body. Then came Yorktown at the end of the war. Soon, Thaddeus was back in the fighting, promoted to field commander by General Greene. With the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, the war slowed considerably. The British forces still occupied a few key areas in America. But on November 14, 1782, Thaddeus led his men against the British near Charleston in South Carolina in one of the final battles of the Revolutionary War. The war ended in 1783, and he returned to his native Poland in a desperate effort, in fact, to help push back the Russians who had just invaded his country. He fought bravely for Poland against the invaders. Soon they promoted him, in fact, to the head of the Polish army. But the Russians and their allies proved too strong, and his loyal army was defeated and he was captured. He was held in a prison until 1796, finally released by a new czar when the old one had died. He returned to America to see his former colleagues and friends and to settle his estate in the new American nation. While he was there, he looked up his old friend Thomas Jefferson, anxious to see him after so many years. The two men, they were kindred spirits, really talked the politics of freedom and the philosophy of freedom and strengthened their long friendship. Thaddeus was awarded by Congress back pay of $15,000 for his service during the war because he did all his work without pay. He was also given a large tract of land near what is today Columbus, Ohio. But he knew that he needed to return to Europe because he was needed, he felt, in France, concerned over how the French Revolution was now deteriorating into the Reign of Terror. But before leaving America, he asked his friend, Thomas Jefferson, pulled him aside, and he said, "I want you to be the executor of my will." Thaddeus wanted his entire American estate of cash and also his property to be sold, and the funds used to purchase the freedom of American slaves, particularly Thomas Jefferson's own slaves, who Thaddeus had gotten to know, and also to pay the expenses of educating those newly freed blacks to become solid citizens of the new republic. Thaddeus insisted, in fact, that Thomas Jefferson tackle that responsibility himself. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, though always supportive of Jefferson as an American leader and revolutionary hero, continually coaxed and needled Jefferson about the necessity of living up to his sacred words written in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Thaddeus Kosciuszko was widely lauded for both his military skill and his exploits with the American army, but more so, and I think this is more important, really, he was lauded for his moral character. This was a time when the discussion of equality and helping the little guy was rarely, if ever, addressed. It just wasn't part of the culture. That Jefferson and others, in fact, were focused on such issues was important to Thaddeus, for its prominent placement in our founding documents laid the groundwork for the major changes that would come to America and Britain, and then to the rest of the world. Thaddeus was always recognized as a man sympathetic to the downtrodden, whether the Jews in his own country of Poland, but also the many destitute in the world, the poor, the suffering, anyone, in fact, whose rights were being violated, whether peasants, serfs, or slaves in any land, including the new nation that he had fought for and was wounded for. He wanted to protect and defend. Like the American founders that he knew and he admired so very much, wealth and power was never his goal. As a man, Thaddeus had the reputation of being kind to children and generous to anyone he knew in need. He was giving of his resources, seemingly uninterested in activities that accumulated land or money, but instead he would give whatever he had away to worthy causes or to those in need around him. Thaddeus Kosciuszko was a great American. He was an immigrant in a land and a nation he loved and respected, and beyond his own personal character, which we admire greatly, more importantly, he was a new American who arrived ready, willing, and able to not only give his life for the nation, but also to use his skills and talents to help build up the United States. Above all, he was perhaps the perfect example of a man of character who believed that true men, give more than they ever expect to receive. By every measure, Thaddeus Kosciuszko was an American hero and a charter member. We make him charter member of the legacy of America's great 100 heroes. Appreciate your time. I'm Grandpa Rick.